Our moderator is on her way, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce everybody that is here, and then hopefully by that time we'll be here and we can get started. Back up so everybody can see me. My name is Jennifer Nelson. I am the communications coordinator for the Wilson Center for Science and Justice here at Duke Law. We are very grateful to be able to co-sponsor this event with Duke Sociology. Special thanks to Dr. Cheng, who has done so much to organize this event, especially organize everything with our guest speakers. Our speakers today include Dr. Cheng. He is an assistant professor of sociology here at Duke. He studies how the way state power is legitimized shapes inequalities within communities. His book, The Policing Machine, Enforcement, Endorsements, and the Illusion of Public Input, is about how police resist institutional reforms by cultivating political capital from the community constituents they empower. He has a sociology PhD from Yale and a JD from NYU Law School. Next we have Dr. Michelle Phelps. Dr. Phelps is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Minnesota. Her research is in the sociology of punishment, focusing in particular on the punitive turn in the U.S. through the lenses of policing, probation, and prison. She is the co-author of Breaking the Pendulum, The Long Struggle Over Criminal Justice, which traces the history of U.S. criminal justice reforms from the birth of the penitentiary to contemporary struggles to end mass incarceration. Her most recent book, right there, The Minneapolis Reckoning, Race, Violence, and the Politics of Policing in America, explores the Black Lives Matter protests and politics of police reform in Minneapolis before and after the murder of George Floyd. Her book comes out in May 2024. Dr. Michael Sierra Arévalo is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Sierra Arévalo's research employs quantitative and qualitative methods to investigate police culture, behavior, and legitimacy. Drawing on ethnographic fieldwork and interviews with police officers in 3 U.S. police departments, his book, The Danger Imperative, Violence, Death, and the Soul of Policing, shows how policing's cultural preoccupation with violence and death shapes police practice and social inequality. Our moderator, who should be here shortly, is Dr. Andrea Leverance. She is professor of sociology and department head of the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at NC State. Her research focuses broadly on issues related to community crime and incarceration, including the impacts of crime and incarceration on individuals and communities. Her most recent book, Intersecting Lives, How Place Shapes Reentry, focuses on the process through which neighborhood and place influence reentry experiences and how these shape community life. Her first book, The Ex-Prisoner's Dilemma, How Women Negotiate Competing Narratives of Reentry and Desistance, looks at how women talk about and manage competing messages about what it means to return to their communities post-incarceration, and how their experiences are shaped by their roles as women, Black women, mothers, daughters, sisters, romantic partners, and employees. As I mentioned, Dr. Cheng's book is available for sale here today, so you can get that when we leave, right here in the servery where you got your lunch. That's from the Gothic bookshop here on campus. And unfortunately, while we do not have the other 2 books, you can pre-order them, and the Gothic bookshop will fulfill those orders and then let you know when they're available. So that you can do that as well. Thank you again for joining us. While we're waiting, I don't know if anybody wants to say anything more about the book. So we're waiting for Dr. Leverance.
Yeah. So should we just go in order and let a brief synopsis?
Sure.
So thank you everyone for being here today. Thank you to the Sociology Department, the Bloom Endowment who funded a lot of this today's event. Thank you to the Wilson Center and to Jennifer for coordinating everything, and to the fellow panelists. So my name is Tony Cheng. I'm an assistant professor at sociology in the department at Duke. And so my book, The Policing Machine, Enforcement, Endorsements, and the Illusion of Public Input, draws on a variety of public records and ethnographic data on America's largest police department, the New York Police Department, and essentially argues that police build community relationships and leverage them and cultivate them as political capital in order to resist institutional reforms. And so the book details a variety of strategies for how they attempt to do so, such as distributing sound permits strategically on a smaller scale, but also on a more macro scale, doing things like building up an alternative system of neighborhood representatives through, in New York they call them community councils, but they're present in many other communities as well. And so the reason why the policing machine is so important, those strategies that I'm referring to collectively is what I'm referring to as the policing machine. The reason why it's so important is because it creates an illusion of public input. It establishes a social order where community preferences towards police emerge either with a stage or through struggle, depending on how it aligns with police priorities. And in doing so, police can then claim accountability to the constituents who they cultivated from the bottom up, rather than the institutions that are designed to regulate them. So thank you everyone again for being here, and I'll turn it over.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. And we have our moderator. Thank you. We're just introducing the books a bit. My book, I was starting in 2016. I had started a study in Minneapolis that was trying to look both at how activists in Minneapolis were protesting police violence and what their imagined solutions to the crisis of racialized police violence were, in addition to talking to neighborhood residents in the most impacted neighborhoods, most impacted by both crime in the community and by police violence, North Minneapolis. And so I had actually wrapped up that study. What we were trying to look at was how everyday residents were making sense of this new scrutiny on police violence and the proposals and solutions that were starting to bubble up about how to address police violence. And so by 2019, I'd actually wrapped up that study, and in 2020, I was writing up a series of papers with a series of students who were collaborating on the project. And we have all of these old versions of the paper where we tried to make a case for why scholars ought to be interested in Minneapolis, which in 2019 felt like a hard argument to make, right? Then, of course, in 2020, George Floyd was murdered just blocks from my house on a path I often went through, and at a corner that had included a coffee shop that I had written part of those papers at. And so instead of stopping the project as we had intended to, instead I pivoted and relaunched the project, trying to trace the aftermath of that murder and all of the ways it did and did not change city politics in Minneapolis. And so all of the data that I had collected in that 2016, 2017 to 2019 period became kind of preamble for a story I didn't know that I was going to be telling ultimately. So the book is structured as kind of a preamble. How do we get to this moment? How do we get to the Powderhorn Declaration, where a veto-proof majority of the Minneapolis City Council promised to end or dismantle the Minneapolis Police Department? And what happens afterwards? I wound up going into the historical archive. So chapter 1 is actually a history of the city and its police department and how we get the spatialized racial inequality in Minneapolis that becomes so infamous and its consequences so infamous in 2020. And what I argue in the book is that we need to understand police violence and community violence as ultimately deeply interconnected, and deeply interconnected in the sense that it is the same communities who are at most at risk in violence on their streets from one another and from the police. And why that matters is, first, obviously, we want to concentrate public resources and attention to problems in those communities and this disproportionate impact of both forms of violence. But it also creates what I talk about as a political stalemate, that efforts to try to address racialized police violence often stymie even in these left-leaning progressive cities because police represent both this threat of violence, particularly now that we've seen the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and activism to really make that salient, but they also still represent the promise of state protection. And it's that promise of state protection that city leaders lean against to bulwark against change in policing. So I'm delighted to be here today because I think Tony and I's books are actually really beautifully in conversation, because whereas Tony focuses on how police departments manage the political process, my book is really focused on that political process and the role of activists and residents and city leaders with the police negotiating over these questions of public safety. And I end the book by thinking about a couple of the new models, of alternative models of public safety that emerged in Minneapolis and elsewhere to try and grapple with whether those represent real alternatives to policing. or whether they are inevitably going to be limited by the same limits placed on police, which is that police largely cannot solve the social problems that precipitate crime, right, and that they're called in to respond to. So the book is really a call to take violence seriously and to think about root causes and structural approaches. Ultimately, I think we'll need massive levels of investments to address, right? And not even the kinds of investments that we could simply repurpose by, for instance, entirely defunding police. Like the scale of investment we need is actually much, much larger, and the conversation needs to be much bigger. And the question of violence and how that shapes the politics of policing also, I think, is a beautiful tie-in to the next book that you'll hear about. So I'm really glad to be here today and be in conversation with you all.
Hi, everyone. Grateful to be here today. Thank you for taking the time out of your day, even if it was just for the Mo's. I appreciate you being here. So my book, unlike Michelle's and Tony's, is very much like in the car with police officers, on patrol with them. And so similar to Michelle, my entree into this work was precipitated by an instance of police violence, specifically the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson. At the time, I was doing work on violence prevention, and I had grand plans for a dissertation about the implementation of something called Project Longevity in New Haven, so studying the service providers, studying the interrupters, studying the police, the prosecutors. It was going to be a great project, or so I thought. And then Michael Brown was killed, and I, like everybody else, I say everybody else, but I was surprised at how little we knew. So I was reading the same op-eds as everybody else was, that, we don't even know how many people are shot by the police every year. And that just didn't sit right with me. I didn't understand how that could be the case. So this was years before the Washington Post collected that data for The Counted. This is years before other nonprofit groups and journalists began addressing that problem that the federal government continues to fail at addressing. I began to learn that we didn't even have a good estimate of the number of police officers in the country. That census was a decade old at the time that I began looking into this. And so I increasingly came to the conclusion that to understand what I wanted to know about, which was the how and why of police violence, I wasn't going to get there with surveys. I wasn't going to get there with FBI uniform crime reports. I wasn't going to get there with existing data. And so I needed to sort of take it back to what people were doing in the 1970s, when the empirical study of police really blossomed in the US, and that was get into a car. And so I leveraged connections that I had made in the world of violence prevention to start with one department, Elmont on the East Coast. I eventually expanded to 2 more departments, West River on the West Coast, Sunshine in the Southwest. And my project was originally going to be something about community policing, and I got a bunch of boilerplate language about what community policing was. I was like, it's not that interesting. They're just saying what it says on the website, essentially. I wanted to potentially ask about police suicide, because I looked at the facts that police suicides are 2 to 4 times as common as police homicides. Unsurprisingly, people didn't want to talk to me about suicide. But as I began doing these ride-alongs, cops talked incessantly about officer safety. If I asked, why'd you do this? Officer safety. Why didn't you do that? Officer safety. Why'd you park here? Officer safety. The word just kept coming up. And so it wasn't my plan to study violence and danger and threat, but that's what the field led me to. That was how they understood their world. And so as a good practicing sociologist, I let the field inform the direction of my inquiry. And the conclusion of the book, the argument, is based around articulating the maintenance of what I call the danger imperative, a cultural frame that is centered on preoccupation with violence and the necessity of ensuring officer safety at all times. And so while a lot of existing work has talked about the academy and what you might consider sort of a download model of culture, as in you go into the academy, you download the culture, and now you're a police officer, I push back a little bit on this as sort of simplistic. The academy is the shortest part of an officer's career. And instead, the academy is really important, to be very clear. The whole first chapter is about the academy. But it's about the daily practices. It's about these very taken for granted things in the police department. It's memorial walls, it's tattoos, it's clothing, it's music. It's about your daily lineups and these announcements that you get, either in the form of hot sheets or in lineup videos, officers getting assaulted, officers getting killed, getting stabbed. Officer safety bulletins that are part of this vast thing that I call the threat network, where you're actually using information sharing architecture that dates back to the 70s, that was expanded by the global war on terror and DHS, and now this just disseminates and crowdsources information about threat from officers in one department to every department that's part of this network. And that manifests on how officers see the world and how they move in the world. That's chapter 4. And the central conclusion of the book that I try to push us towards is that this is not the system malfunctioning. This is the system actually doing exactly what it was designed to do. And so to think about police violence as the logical conclusion of what we have built the system to be. These are not mistakes or errors. These are predictable things that happen. And I push us to think about a different way to have our conversation around policing. So I think I am increasingly skeptical of procedural justice training and legitimacy training this, and we're going to fix it with body cameras that, and what tasers are going to do. I think that the institution is violent. And I think actually we start there, that this is a violent institution. It's designed to be violent. It's supposed to be violent. That suddenly we have a different way of having that conversation about what comes next. And so I think that that is what I'm pushing us towards. In fact, this idea of police violence, community violence being intertwined, I think that public safety and officer safety are actually intertwined. And that's what I push for at the end of the book, is what are strategies that we can take that simultaneously enhance safety for community members and for officers that walk the same streets. Currently, we have those two as very separate conversations. And I think that police should actually be leading in calls for addressing violence at the community level, as opposed to continuing to hoard resources so they can take professional dominance over that particular problem. See.
So first of all, I apologize for being late. I said yesterday I was going to be in plenty of time so that I would be super early and not rush in late and frazzled. And did not leave super early, hit an accident, and rushed in late and super frazzled. So that does not reflect my enthusiasm for being here and these three books. I think this is a great opportunity to think about and talk about these three books in conversation with one another. So on the one hand, they are all about policing and policing as an institution today. All three sort of are grounded in these key moments of the deaths of Eric Garner and Michael Brown and George Floyd, but they're also about these more daily ways in which police functions as an institution. My goal here is to basically facilitate a conversation. I have a couple of questions to start, but then hopefully most of the time is coming from community questions or the questions from you all. If you haven't already read these books, I strongly encourage you to read them all as quickly as you can. So you all spoke about this a little bit, but I'm wondering, so again, each of you are talking about police as an institution. There are some themes that I think run throughout your three books, including police attempts to control the narrative, police as political actors, police response to violence, both to them and against the community, and also around their perceptions of the necessity of police. You each spoke a little bit, I think, about how your three books speak to one another, but I wonder if you could expand on that a little bit, because you also each do take, you have a very different lens, a very different focus, and so I think it shifts a little bit when you think about them together. So, and I know you're all familiar with each other's work, so I wonder if you can speak a little bit more about that. It was notable to me that, Michelle, you sort of framed this as police violence and community violence are interconnected, and then Michael pointed out that community safety and police safety are interconnected, so maybe that's something that you can expound on, but any, like, kind of how you see these working together, fitting together.
Well, I'm happy to start. I mean, Michael features prominently in my conclusion, although I wasn't able to cite the book, but I cited the article versions that came first. That's right. You know, I think one of the things I was trying to do in my book, and for a while when I first started writing, this was really stifling for me. It took a long time to break past this, because I was trying to start a conversation between the people that I saw sort of in my communities and in my networks who were pushing on the abolitionist side of the ledger, which included a lot of my colleagues in sociology, and the folks who were more on the reform side of the ledger, which included a lot of my colleagues in criminology. So because I was sort of situated between those two disciplines, I felt like the conversations that I was seeing from both of those communities were talking past each other, right? And one of the things I wanted to do with the book was to really force those two threads into a more direct conversation about what it might mean to take seriously the limits of reform and to think seriously about what practical steps towards abolition would look like, right? This sort of in-between space, or abolitionists sometimes talk about this as non-reformist reforms. You can also think about them as sort of transformational reforms. And I think one of the things that we take from the abolitionists, and is so clearly articulated in Michael's work, as you just heard, is that we cannot understand policing outside of violence, right? Like the threat of violence is what makes the police for both good and ill, right? Like that is the whole reason that people call in the police often, right? Is because they want that power of coercion. And that's one of the both benefits and limitations of a lot of these alternative models like non-armed emergency crisis responders, right? When they come into the situation, context where people are in crisis, they cannot compel behavior because they do not have that same people do not have the same sort of regulatory obligations to those agents of the state as we do towards police. And those staffers are unarmed, they are in cars that don't have sirens, they are not wearing bulletproof vests, and their instructions are, if there's any hint of violence, you need to get out of that situation and smash down on the call police button that they wear on their vest, right? That is their one sense of security, is that they can call in the police in those moments of crisis. So, I think there's sometimes a false conversation in the reform spaces that we just have to tightly regulate it, that we can get to a place where we have the right kind of violence against the right kind of targets in the right kind of moment, and then policing will be more legitimate, right? If that violence is just more tightly regulated, and therefore it won't be unjust or illegitimate violence. And I think sometimes that conversation elides this sort of fundamental reality that we need to have a broader conversation about when do we want to be using state coercion and when do we want people that carry this threat of violence to be entering into scenes. So that's one point of connection that I think is really helpful.
Yeah, for sure. I think that my goal with writing this book was in many ways to facilitate that same conversation between sociologists and criminologists. Sociologists have largely abdicated the study of police for the purpose of studying police for the better part of half a century. And I'm happy to say that we now have people that are very conservatively looking at this, as well as folks like Sarah Brain and Donica Gordon and others, where they're looking at police because they want to understand the police. Not even necessarily as a case of a thing, but because it's important to study the police. It's a powerful institution. And I wanted to use sociological tools to just show policing on its own terms. How do police understand their work? How do they explain what they do and why they do it? And this is not a story of monsters, it's a story of men in the system. It's a story of people that are put into a cultural context that changes the likelihood of certain kinds of behaviors happening. That's what a frame is, it's a filter. Frames are not destiny, culture is not destiny, but it does make some outcomes more likely than others given a set of circumstances. And that's what the book is all about. And I think that by the end of it, the book is not full of examples of shootings and egregious brutality. It's actually about mundane violence. Most police violence is not shootings. Most police violence is grabbing somebody, pushing somebody, handcuffing somebody. It's low level on the spectrum of violence. But it has other characteristics. It is preemptive. Officers engage in violence before violence happens. If you're not familiar with the work of Seth Stoughton, highly recommended, faculty at South Carolina. This kind of violence is daily. It happens far more often. But the mechanisms at play, the vigilance before violence happens, all of that is consistent across low-level violence and high-level violence. And those are sort of the basic building blocks that you need to have a conversation about reform or about abolition. And I think what I'm trying to provide is like an empirical kind of, this is what the institution is, do with that what you will. And in the conclusion, I provide reform options, and I provide a discussion of what this means for the project of abolition, the process versus the binary state of cops, no cops. And so on the way to a world where we do not rely on police single-mindedly to ensure officer safety, I think there are very tangible steps that we can take. As I describe in the book, I believe that public safety and officer safety frequently are discussed completely separately. Officers are essentially the only ones responsible for ensuring officer safety. They get badges and a gun and a bulletproof vest, in legal powers, and they're told like, all right, go be safe. And they tell each other to be safe ad nauseum. And then community safety, public safety, is something that only police apparently can provide for. Instead, we know that there's other ways to reduce violence, and they're relatively simple, cheap things. If you believe in RCTs, improving lighting, greening lots, fixing facades of buildings can reduce violence and crime. There's some evidence to suggest that planting trees in lighted urban areas can reduce crime by reducing ambient temperature. Recent study from a group of economists showed that if you increase behavioral health treatment centers at the county level, you specifically reduce the number of assaults on police officers. Cops should be the first ones in line calling for these things. It's not extra work for them, and safer streets mean safer streets for them too, since they're the ones that spend time on those streets. But instead, and this is I think where Michelle's work and Tony's work shines, the messaging does not align with like the empirical reality. Instead, the messaging is about, look what a great job we're doing, we are the ones best suited to address these problems, or we're under attack. I talk about that in the introduction to the book with the assassination of Wen Jianlu and Rafael Ramos. That's policing's word for assassination. And I think Tony mentions that at the beginning of his book as well. The messaging doesn't accord with what we know about what works for violence, and instead it's all about ensuring and perpetuating professional and institutional dominance in that space. I would prefer for the FOP, for the Police Benevolence Association, for the IACP, to call for non-police interventions. Cops want more things off their plate. And that's the irony, is that if you talk to officers, they don't want to go to mental health calls. They don't want to go to these petty disputes about trash cans. But they know they have to. And so, oddly enough, like a lot of line-level officers do actually, in theory, believe in the process of abolition. They just hate the word, and they don't want anyone to touch their overtime. And it's hard to get around some of those ground-level realities. But I think that both of y'all's work speaks to how and why that happens, whether it be through Twitter or through city council.
Yeah, and I'll just say a few quick words, but just in terms of thinking about the construction of this panel and event, the reason why I think Michael and Michelle's books and my book are so complementary to one another is because I think they represent an exciting time, which we talked about earlier, about how sociologists have important things to say about legal institutions and about policing specifically. And so I think each of our works provide different perspectives. So I think we talked earlier about Michelle's book providing an excellent perspective about capital P politics and those processes. I try to complement that with providing a lowercase p politics and how police departments like the NYPD engage with different community stakeholders strategically and selectively in order to cultivate political capital. And I think Michael's book provides an excellent overview and a framework for how violence shapes every aspect of policing and communities. And so I draw on Michael's work to make my argument in the book about how the salience of violence shortens people's time frames and people's time horizons, such that by emphasizing how violent things are, people are more likely to voice particular community complaints in police department channels, and police are able to exercise control over how those complaints may be recorded and represented in those department control channels. And then there are other channels that I talk about in the book, but I'll leave it there for now.
My next question is the qualitative sociology nerd question, so hopefully this is interesting to other people in the room. But can you talk a little bit about how your own positionality shaped, you talked about how you sort of entered these projects, but can you talk about how your own positionality shaped the questions you asked, access you were able to get, how people responded to you, and at least in Michelle's case, your research team in the field, and then the lens you took in the analysis?
I'll go first on this one. So for those of you that don't know, policing is dominated by men. I know. I'm sorry to say.
really insightful
I know.
observation.
That's the whole first chapter. So I think that like there's just no way around it. It's a male-dominated institution. It's been described as an institution that is male in like practice and ethos and culture. And I think that I happen to be like a straight man, and that was important. I have other colleagues that have been inside police departments and they've experienced very different things, either again Sarah Bray, my colleague in Texas, Samantha Simon in Arizona, who did a project on police training. Her book is Before the Badge, by the way, pick that one up too, it's great. And they just experienced very different things. I did not experience like sexual harassment at all. No one was hitting on me in the police department, didn't happen. But in more fundamental ways, I was 24 when I began the work. Turns out I was the same age as a lot of new police officers. I was interested in things, again, by happenstance, that they were also interested in. We could talk about Call of Duty. We could talk about weightlifting. We could talk about like sports or whatever. I mean, I faked the sports thing, like I looked at the scores before going in, but like I have played sports in my life. Tattoos, other things that allowed to sort of bridge that social distance. Similarly, I think one of the biggest things at the time, if you remember, Yale was going through a real difficult political moment where it was like a stained glass mural that was shattered by a staff member because it depicted an enslaved person like in the glass. So they broke the window. There was big protests. The Christakis thing about Halloween costumes, just look away, was going. And so Yale was just like in the news as like this hive of liberal tomfoolery. And I was from Yale. And so there was an assumption about my politics, about my position, about why I was there. I don't think it's accidental that I was like visibly brown, and one officer was like, "Oh, you don't look what I thought you looked like," and I have a big mouth. So I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, like I don't know, like you work out." I was like, "Okay." But so to navigate that, they would make comments. I think that, "Oh, it must be really expensive." And so I'd explain that actually, like there's a stipend, and I would pivot, and I went to state schools. Like I went to a public university, I went to public schools growing up. They loved the fact that I was from Texas. That seemingly bestowed like some credibility. Like I can't be that liberal if I'm from Texas. And I knew how to shoot a gun. My mom was in the Army. They loved that. She's a veteran. My grandfather was a police officer in Colombia. So all of these things by happenstance, it allowed me to sort of move past the barriers that are put in place where there's an assumed distance. Like my politics are my politics, and like I disagree with them vehemently about many things that they said or what they believed, but it was a mechanism that allowed me to get close enough to ask things that I might not otherwise have been able to ask. And those things were constantly negotiated. They were things that, again, I didn't like plan to do this work because I was a 24-year-old man. It just happened to be the space that I moved into, and I leveraged those things willingly all of the time.
Well, I'm happy to pick up there because, people often ask me, like, and they should ask me more after reading Tony's book, like, where is the MPD in your story, right? And why there's a whole book about the MPD and you, like, barely talk about them, and did you even talk to officers? And the truth is I did start with doing ride-alongs in what was then the 4th Precinct in North Minneapolis. And I had some informational interviews with some of the precinct leadership. But at the time I was doing that field work, I was pregnant. And I was going on ride-alongs 4 and 5 months pregnant with a bulletproof vest and reaching the end of my plausible deniability about my pregnancy. And I thought it was going to be damn near impossible to find officers who were going to be willing to go on ride-alongs with like a very visibly pregnant and diminutive statured white woman. Like I thought that was probably pretty unlikely that they were going to continue to want to hang out with me. And then I was going to community events where I had a newborn strapped to my carriage. So there's actually a media photo that I'm in the background of with one of my kids because she was doing field work with me for a while. And again, like you can't do a ride-along with a newborn. I don't know if any of you were thinking about doing that, but it's not a great idea. It's not super feasible. And so that's part of the story. I mean, part of the story is the more I thought about the police, the more I was more interested in everybody kind of around them than I was in the police themselves. But your positionality really does matter for these access questions. And gender is super salient, obviously. Race is obviously salient. And so where I felt my own whiteness the most was in interactions with activists who in Minneapolis were a multiracial cast, but obviously there was a number of very prominent Black activists. who were really distrustful of certain white political actors in the city. Because Minneapolis is a predominantly white city, even the sort of like Black Lives Matter protests in the post-Jamar Clark period, those were still pretty racially diverse spaces, a lot of the sort of like movement organizing included a lot of white folks, and there was a lot of like white allyship in Minneapolis. But I had to prove my politics to activists before they would talk to me, right? And they would talk to me about, talk about your politics, talk about what you're hoping to do with this project, and they would vet me, right? And vet me with other folks, like, is she trustworthy, right? And I approached that in part when we were thinking in particular about the interviews with neighborhood residents. I did that with a team of students of color, and it's not that I actually purposely designed it that way. It was actually the other way around. Students were coming to me because they knew I was interested in policing, and I'd started these interviews with activists. And I had a student on a McNair fellowship one summer, and I said to him, okay, like, here's what I'm working on the project right now. What piece of this would you like to plug into? And it was actually that undergraduate student who said, I really want to interview residents who live in neighborhoods like the one I grew up in, and I want to think about how they're experiencing this moment and how they're getting left out of this political conversation that is about them. And yet there's all these political actors sort of speaking for poor communities of color, but not really listening to those communities themselves. And so a number of students of color then joined the research team once they found out that we were doing this project. And so it just became a labor of love with a big collaboration. And people ask me a lot, like, okay, so you were collaborating with a team of students of color, you were designing the interview guide, which changed over time as new things were happening and the field was moving, because it was a 2-year period, in part because I was on maternity leave part of it, and I was, we were all coming in and out, and it was a shifting group of people. And so people ask, like, oh, well, how did people's, racial positionality in particular shape how the kinds of questions they wanted to ask and the kinds of ways they interpreted the answers? And my answer to that question is always that it mattered a lot less than you might think, because we were all sort of steeped in a sociological tradition and we're speaking a sort of similar theoretical lens. And so, a lot of my students had more personal and direct lived experiences, and it felt like they were, these are things their family members had gone through in a way that was not visceral in the same way for me. And that then became one of our insights, right? And it wasn't just about what communities of color were experiencing, it was about what white residents were doing in those neighborhoods, how they were experiencing this conversation, and how white people in Minneapolis were then taking this conversation, right? And attempting to kind of be the spokespeople for or ally with communities of color, but very strategically picking sort of which spokespeople they were listening to, right? And who they saw as the voice of those communities. So the story became about all of us, right? And about how people's racial positionality shaped how they were perceived in those public debates over public safety in this left-leaning city. So my methodological appendix actually includes almost no methodological details. I have footnotes that are like, go read the article versions if you want to like geek out on the method detail. It's actually just a long reflection about like what it means to be a white person doing this research and the ways in which we should expect communities to be suspicious, and rightfully so, given the long history of academic exploitation in poor communities of color in particular, and what it might mean to think about a more just vision of how we do sociological scholarship. And I talk about how much my students taught me. I mean, this book is actually dedicated to my students, and the chapter that draws on the collaborative data collection is co-authored with the 2 students who took the lead on the data analysis of that chapter, Amber Joy Powell and Chris Robertson. And so I talk about what it might mean to do sociology as a more collaborative endeavor and the benefits of that approach.
Yeah, and so I guess I wouldn't describe my book as an ethnography of police per se, but very much like Michelle, I would describe it as an ethnography of police through community, because the NYPD never actually granted me formal access. And so over the course of months, the NYPD repeatedly denied my requests for interviews and other forms of access, either explicitly through emails or implicitly just through silence. And so I think this reflects the point about how state institutional actors can also be hard to reach populations, though of course for very different reasons than the marginalized populations that we typically apply the hard to reach population label to. And so on the one hand, the denials, I think, generated a unique set of public data sources that I used to inform the study, everything from sound permits to social media posts and the like. But at the same time, I also learned that the NYPD did not deny everyone's request for access, and so they were working with institutional partners to conduct evaluations of the same programs that I was interested in. And so I think this reflects not just a methodological point, but a substantive point about how police departments under the policing machine form strategic relationships and engage in strategic politics. And so nonetheless, most of my data comes from observing meetings and other public sources. And so as an Asian American male, I believe that I was able to navigate a lot of the spaces with much more third-party neutrality than I would have with many other demographic combinations. And as a student at the time while I was doing the study, I was always transparent about my status as a student. I always carried around a book bag with me. And the questions that I would receive are typically in New York just about where I lived and what was my goals. And I think everyone in the community and even the officers respected the fact that that I was there to study and observe the meetings, and I attended them regularly. But yeah.
I'm going to ask one more question and then open it up to the rest of you. Okay, so Michael has referenced the sort of masculinity of policing a couple of times. I think we all know that both policing is now we know that policing is dominated by men, and also often what we hear about the victims of police violence are dominated by men, and community violence. Those narratives are often dominated by men, and partly because this is in the forefront of my mind, having heard a talk yesterday, I think, by Shannon Malone Gonzalez, who focuses on Black women's experience of police violence, and so. The question of gender is the broad question of how gender shapes all of this, right? And Michelle, you talked about being a pregnant white woman in these spaces, and so that's a sort of different way that gender can come up. So gender more broadly, but also specifically where women come into your stories and the research that you did, if at all. And if not, what that absence means. So should you start?
Sure, I'm happy to start. Yeah. So most of my observations and field studies took place in different community meetings. Ones that were run by police officers themselves, which provide certain benefits to the police department, but others run by community members themselves who are elected to run those community councils, church meetings, and other sorts of meetings. And nonetheless, so the meetings that were either run by officers themselves or were what I call partner channels, where officers would try to cultivate relationships with those select community members. In those meetings, the modal community member that attended them was an older, so the communities I observed were two African American communities and Caribbean populations, and so most of them skewed women, either older women or younger kids, kids under 10 years old, and so that was an interesting dynamic where most of the folks in those meetings they wanted more police services. In the book, I argue how the police department works to cultivate those perspectives and usher those populations towards those meetings. But that was the modal participant or resident in those settings.
Yeah, so Amber Powell and I actually wrote an article from our Northside interviews that focuses just on the women participants of the folks that we talked to in North Minneapolis, and in particular the kind of racialized divide between white women in the neighborhood and women of color who were predominantly Black or African American, although not exclusively. And what we found in that paper, and what we talk about, and is very consistent with a lot of the literature, is that women of color are exposed to both racialized violence and gender-based violence that put them in a really unique bind. So Richie talks about this as the matrix of domination, right? That women are both subjected, women of color are subjected both to the exposure to violence in the household, exposure to violence in the community, and exposure to state violence, both in terms of their own risk of being victimized by state actors, right? So Black women have much higher rates of police violence, experience much higher rates of police violence than white women. But they're also worried about what scholars have called family criminalization, right? So if I'm being abused by a partner, right, do I feel safe calling the cops? Because what is going to happen when they show up? And even if there's no overt violence, what we typically think of as violence, right? Nobody is beaten, nobody is shot. The violence of arrest, right, and the violence of detention, and does that actually leave my family better off? And can I trust this system that I know is racist to solve this problem for me, right? And so the women of color that we talked to really felt that bind in a way that the white women just didn't. And it wasn't that the white women were never exposed to gender-based violence. Of course, in some cases they were. And in some cases, we even had white women who had been arrested themselves. But those experiences weren't dominated by this pervasive mistrust of the state, because the state had largely treated them fairly, even in those interactions where they were arrested, right? Like, I was high on drugs, I was doing X, Y, and Z, and the police officer was very nice when he arrested me, right? So they didn't have this double layer of victimization on top of it. And what was really tragic in those interviews, and what we try to grapple with in the paper, was that women of color would talk about being targeted by police, would talk about their own experiences of harassment, but then they would say, oh, but I don't really have it that bad because I'm not a man, right? And it's my son, it's my boyfriend, it's my husband, it's my dad that I'm really worried about, right? And we had all of these women who were the parents of teenagers who were just desperately upset, right? Like, telling us about how they told their son to cut off his dreadlocks, right? Because they know that he's going to be profiled if he has that hairstyle. Or that, multiple young men couldn't travel in a car together because that would look too suspicious to the police. So the women are investing all of this emotional energy, and then they'll tell us casually, right? Like, oh, well, I got arrested and got ticketed, and that actually caused me to lose my job. And like these really awful stories of where they had been directly impacted, but they still weren't perceiving themselves as the primary targets, right, or the primary victims, because of this intense concentration of policing among men. And it's really interesting to put those conversations and those experiences in dialogue with the interviews that I was doing with the activists affiliated with Black Lives Matter and related movements, who were predominantly women, right? So the people doing the labor work, the people doing the movement work, were actually more likely to be women of color than to be men of color. And so there was this really interesting dynamic where the focus on victimhood was very much about the men, but the actual labor of the movement was being carried by women, right? And part of that was expanding sort of the definition and awareness about the women victims of police violence. But part of it was women mobilizing for their community. And it is women activists who kind of have the loudest voice in my book, because they were the ones that were most prevalent. The people who were leading the abolitionist campaigns in Minneapolis were largely queer women of color and non-binary folks who had multiple intersecting identities and ways that they were experiencing discrimination in the world. So the story of gender here, I think, is not just about the gender of the police, but it's also about the gender of the public, and who then gets to speak for the public, and who's doing that labor, both reproductive labor of the family criminalization and managing that process, but also the movement labor of trying to mobilize a state response to that injustice.
Yeah, so most of my time was with officers. My analytic focus is not on those contacted, though you do see multiple instances talking about folks that are contacted by police in the book. And one of the more overtly disrespectful, aggressive interactions that I observed was between a black male officer and a small white woman. And so like the aggression that was displayed in that particular incident is deeply gendered. It's the kind of thing where you likely felt comfortable bashing in this door and pushing somebody out of the doorway because you're 6 feet tall, 200 pounds, and this person is clearly 5'4", 140 pounds soaking wet. It's unlikely, in my professional opinion, that you engage in an interaction in quite the same way. More generally, when it comes to the officers, though, I think when you read this book, it's a story of consistency. Some people, I think, make the assumption that departments on the East Coast must be radically different from the West Coast and the Southwest. And like, look, there is some variation, but the story is very much one of consistency across space and time, and it's about consistency across types of officers. I talk to black officers, white officers, Latino officers, men, women, veterans, non-veterans, rookies, super tenured officers. And I'll tell you that no one thought their job wasn't dangerous. They all had that as something very firm in their understanding of their work. And I'll plug her book again. You know, Sam Simon's book explains that part of that is a filtering process. If you are not keyed into the fact that violence is important, and if you're not showing evidence in the academy that you are able, willing, and capable to use violence, you wash out. You don't get to be a police officer. And so in some ways, I'm dealing with the after effects. I don't see the officers that have a fundamentally different view of what policing is, because they don't usually get to stay police officers very long. And so I think that while sociologists and social scientists more generally are preoccupied with variation, and in some cases like don't believe you if you're like, no, actually it's a story of consistency. This book is very much a story about how different kinds of officers across all these different axes, they all kind of view their work the same way. And that's in part because they're part of the same institution. You don't get to stay a part of policing if you don't fundamentally believe in the value of being preoccupied with violence and providing for your safety at all times. You become a risk. You become an officer safety liability. And it's one of the fastest ways to get kicked out of the police department. And so in that way, gender is instructive in that it did not have as much variation as you might think. So women officers would talk about how, and they would look at me like, look, I'm 5 foot whatever. I'm not gonna like fight you if I'm by myself. I'll call other officers who are much larger than I am, and they will fight you. But that didn't mean the danger imperative didn't work for them. They just had different strategies for fulfilling the mandates of the danger imperative. And I think that's one of the overarching points here, is that you can have different races, different ages, different experiences, but that preoccupation with violence is very consistent.
That's a good question. This goes back, Michael, to something you said much earlier on, but talking about how the vast majority of violence is, relatively speaking, lower level violence. But the way I think about it is the presence of a gun, which a gun is part of an officer's uniform, so they're never without it. The presence of a gun is what enables the lower level violence to happen, right? And so underlying that is the threat that if the lower level violence is responded to in kind, it can escalate and become the more serious violence very quickly. And so I'm wondering how you think about that. Like, for me, it impacts the framing of the lower level violence significantly, because it's not just a shove, it's a shove that, if you shove back, becomes something very different. And so when we talk about lower level violence, I'm wondering how you frame that, to keep in mind that it's always with the threat of that escalation so present and at front of mind.
So I don't agree with the claim that in policing writ large, it is necessarily the case that the underlying threat is lethal violence. We have departments in all parts of the world that don't necessarily have guns. The threat of violence is there. So police don't have to have guns for there to be a threat of greater levels of violence, whether that be through different implements like a baton or some other kind of weapon, or just other officers like piling on top of you and using more violence. I do think that in the US context, or context where you do have firearms on the hips of officers at all times, it is very much the case that there's always at least one gun at the scene, and it's the officer's gun. I think that changes the overall stakes for officers in particular. And so what you hear officers talk about is that the risk of being disarmed justifies the use of lethal violence in some cases. So even if someone takes away your taser, the taser itself is not lethal, but the threat of being tased and being incapacitated and having your weapon taken can then justify the use of lethal force in the minds of officers who are operating within the reasonableness standard. So I use the word lower level violence as a descriptive term to look at that particular instantiation of violence. I think we get into sticky territory if we begin to assume that lower level violence necessitates a firearm, because that I don't think is true. Lower level violence happens all the time in policing without a firearm being present. I think you might look at what violence occurs that wouldn't have otherwise happened if there wasn't a gun present, and I don't know how we articulate that sort of counterfactual social science question, but I think it's certainly possible.
And I'll just chime in on that with a slightly different bent, which is just to say, I mean, I think the story of guns in America is so fundamental to this story. So American police have always carried guns, and it's because the public has always been armed. Like from the very beginning, that was baked into our relationship of how we think about law enforcement. And I tell a story in the conclusion book chapter of the book, which is about a police killing where the initial stories was that there was a man with a gun in his apartment who was having a mental health crisis. The man's name was Teclis Sundberg in Minneapolis. And there was a standoff with police overnight, and at some point something happens. The initial reports were very unclear about what that something was, but something happens, and snipers who were positioned across the street shoot and kill him. And activists mobilize in Minneapolis, and people are starting to say, where was the behavioral crisis response team? Why weren't crisis intervention called into the scene? And the answer was, well, because there was a threat of violence, right? Because there was a gun, and there was a gun that he was shooting. And so that is the kind of situation for which we are always going to imagine police with guns or some kind of institution with guns as responding to. And so protests start to form in Minneapolis. It's starting to get picked up as a national story, but that gets interrupted, which is why I assume many of you haven't heard this name before outside of Minneapolis. And it gets interrupted because a woman interrupts the protest, a woman who looks like she should be a Black Lives Matter protester with pink hair and dark skin. And she shows up and she interrupts it. And she interrupts it because she says, this is not a George Floyd situation. And it turns out that she was Sundberg's neighbor, and that he was in fact shooting into her apartment and had been stalking her. And later body camera footage from the SWAT team's videos would show her babies in diapers running towards the officers in SWAT gear against the sound of active gunfire. Like he was still shooting into the hallway at this moment that the SWAT team was there rescuing her naked children. They were clothed in a diaper, the youngest one. And so she interrupts the protest, sobbing, saying, why aren't you here for me, right? The police saved my life in this case. And it's interesting, she uses George Floyd as the reference point to say, I understand why we would protest police violence, but this is not that case, right? This is a different kind of case. I need you to honor me as a victim. And there's a really tense back and forth between her and the protesters, right? And of course, this blows up on conservative news media as like the hypocrisy of the BLM movement. But I think it really highlighted, like, guns are at the center of this. Like when people say they're scared about getting rid of the police, it's because of guns and it's about gun violence. And the threat that there could be a gun on any call, even though there's usually not other than the officers, but this threat of guns is one of the real impediments to thinking about de-arming the police, really addressing police violence, right? Why can police officers shoot people with impunity? Well, because I thought they had a gun. I thought there was going to be this threat of lethal violence. But it also creates the ambivalent political politics, right? And it was women of color who really felt this dual bind of like, damned if I do and damned if I don't. And so I think we think about guns on the left anyways, we think about guns and the police, but we need to think a lot about guns in the public too, right? And how that sets up the conditions for the danger imperative that Michael talks about.
It turns out I need to apologize again. I thought we had until 2, and it turns out we were supposed to wrap up at 1:30. Do we have time for one more question, or we need to?
I'll stick around. Can I use the bathroom real quick?
Yeah, I think we can do some individual talking, but this room does need to be used shortly, so we need to sort of turn over the room.
Okay. So
But feel free to
we can talk in
individual
the
talk.
hall.
I'll be like right back.
Thank you.